On this first Sunday in February, we continue our series honoring historic Unitarians and Universalists. Today we honor Frances Ellen Watkins Harper because she is a person who really epitomizes the spiritual attribute of courage. Frances was born a free black woman in Maryland on September the 4th, 1825. After her mother died when she was 3, she became an orphan and was then welcomed into the family of her maternal aunt and uncle, Reverend William Watkins, her uncle, was an avid civil rights activist. And he had founded a school, and so she was educated at an early age at the Academy for Negro Youth, and he was always a great influence on her life. After financial hardship hit them, Frances at age 14 began working as a seamstress. With the passage in 1850 of the Fugitive Slave Act, free blacks were no longer safe because they could be kidnapped and taken to another state with no legal protection under the law. So as conditions for free blacks in slave states deteriorated, and Maryland was a slave state, the Watkins family fled from Baltimore. Frances moved on her own to Ohio, where she taught sewing, and then moved to Pennsylvania in 1851. And there, alongside William Still, chairman of the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society, she helped escaped slaves move along the Underground Railroad to get to Canada. You know, when we think of women in the 1850s, we don't think of women, traveling or living independently, particularly women of African descent. So Frances must have been quite courageous because she traveled constantly to support the cause of justice, not only for people of African descent, but also for women. In 1854, her poems on miscellaneous subjects attracted critical notice and became her biggest commercial success. In these poems, she attacked not only racism, but also the oppression of women. So think how many decades this was before women got the right to vote. And she took most of the earnings from her books and her poetry to help free slaves. And in 1854, she began her lecturing career, and she was very much in demand on the anti-slavery speaking circuit, traveling extensively in the years before the Civil War. What I learned in the last couple of weeks was that Frances was a friend of Mary Brown and her husband John Brown, who led the unsuccessful uprising at Harper's Ferry in 1859. Watkins gave a lot of emotional support and comfort to Mary during her husband's trial and execution. In a letter smuggled into John Brown's prison cell, Watkins wrote, "In the name of the young girl sold from the warm clasp of a mother's arms to the clutches of a libertine or profligate, in the name of the slave mother, her heart rocked to and fro by the agony of her mournful separations, I thank you that you have been brave enough to reach out your hands to the crushed and blighted of my race." In 1859, Watkins' tale, The Two Offers, appeared in the magazine Anglo-African. It was the first story published by an African American. And though she worked tirelessly as an abolitionist, she was also a staunch advocate for women's rights. So although the two authors was cast in fictional form, the piece was actually a sermon on the important choices that young people have to make, in particular, young women. The tale relates the tragedy of a young woman who mistakenly thinks romance and married life to be the only goal and center for her life. She writes, "Talk as you will of women's deep capacity for loving, of the strength of her affectional nature. I do not deny it," she writes, "but will the mere possession of any human love fully satisfy all the demands of her whole being? But woman, the true woman, if you would render her happy, needs more than the mere development of her affectional nature. Her conscience should be enlightened, her faith in the true and right established, and scope given to her heaven-endowed and God-given facilities." In 1860, Frances married Fenton Harper, a widower with 3 children, and they moved to Ohio. Later, they had daughter Mary, who was born in 1862. Sadly, Fenton died in 1864, and when that happened, think what the world was like for women in 1864. And so he died, and she had to make the hard, courageous decision to send her children to live with relatives so that she could write and travel and earn money to support them. So after the war was over, Frances Harper continued writing and speaking, and after the war, she toured the South, encouraging education for freed slaves and aiding in Reconstruction. During the next few decades, Harper wrote a great deal and had her works published frequently. Because of her many magazine articles, she was called the mother of African American journalism. And at the same time, she was writing stories and poetry that spoke to an African American audience. She also wrote for periodicals that had a mainly white circulation. And, think about the time in the mid-1800s. So much of the writing really involved the inclusion of biblical images. So Moses, the speaker for freedom, and the Exodus story were important aspects of the imagery that she used in her short stories, novels, and poems. Before the Civil War, in her 1859 speech entitled "Our Greatest Want," she challenged her fellow blacks. She wrote, "Our greatest need is not gold or silver, talent or Jesus, or talent, well, they may have needed Jesus, but talent or genius, but true men and true women. We have millions of our race in the prison house of slavery, but have not yet found a single Moses for freedom." In 1858, 100 years before Rosa Parks, Frances Harper refused to give up her seat or ride in the colored section of a segregated trolley car in Philadelphia. And she wrote one of her most famous poems, "Bury Me in a Free Land," When she got very sick from all of her lecturing and travel, when she wrote the story, The Two Offers, it became the first short story, as I said, to be published by an African American. After the Civil War, with slavery a thing of the past, Harper turned her energy to women's rights. She spoke up for the empowerment of women and worked with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton to secure votes for women. But unlike Anthony and Stanton, Harper supported the 14th Amendment, which together with the 15th granted the vote to black men but not to women. Recognizing the ever-present danger of lynching, she recognized that the African American community needed an immediate political voice. With that would come the possibility of securing further legal and civil rights. And throughout her lifetime, she was active in a growing number of black organizations and came to believe that black reformers needed to set their own priorities. One of the things as I was researching that I had never put two and two together, she was very active from 1883 to 1890 in the National Women's Christian Temperance Union. And she worked with that group in part because it was at that time the most important women's organization to push for expanding federal power. Interesting. So activists like Harper and Willard campaigned not only for racial and sexual equality, but also for a new understanding of the federal government's responsibility to protect rights, regulate morality, and promote social welfare. So think about what's happening in our culture right now and the importance of calling on federal government powers for those people in the 1800s who were the most vulnerable. So both the Unitarians and the African Methodist Episcopal Church claim Harper as a member, sort of like Thomas Jefferson, but she was reluctant to choose between the two. The AME Church was the one that she was raised in. It was family and home to her. And she always remembered where she came from and what her people had been through. Her reasons for joining the Unitarian Church, on the other hand, could have been partly political. Although she had had personal and professional contacts in both black and white communities ever since her first book of poems was published, many doors remained closed to her as a black woman in the 1800s. In a society where color lines were clearly drawn, a Unitarian church provided the rare opportunity for the races to meet. The Unitarians, she knew, could help advance the causes she supported in places she could never go. So Harper had first become acquainted with Unitarians before the war because of their connection with the abolitionist movement and, through education in Ohio. So she became a Unitarian in 1868 when Harper and her daughter settled in Philadelphia in 1870. Actually, when we look at the AME Church and the Unitarian Church, where did she feel most comfortable theologically? Harper's Christology, what she thought about Jesus, was definitely Unitarian. She didn't see Jesus or Christ as a distant God to her, but as a role model for the kind of exalted existence that human beings could attain. In Iola Leroy, which was written in 1892, and it was her final and most famous novel, she envisioned a Christ-like role for African Americans who, by transcending their suffering, had the opportunity to transform society. Harper died on the 22nd of February, 1911, 9 years before women got the right to vote. Her funeral service was at the Unitarian Church on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia, and she's buried in Eden Cemetery next to her daughter, who had died 2 years before. And most of us, had anybody other than Dillman heard of Frances Harper before now? In the 20th century, her reputation and her poetry languished sort of unread. And her gravestone fell over and was covered over with grass. But on it was a verse from her celebrated poem, Bury Me in a Free Land. She wrote, "I ask no monument, proud and high, to arrest the gaze of passers-by. All that my yearning spirit craves is bury me not in a land of slaves." In recent decades, Black women and feminists have resurrected Harper's legacy. And in 1992, African American Unitarian Universalists honored her and commemorated the 100th anniversary of the publication of Iola Leroy. And what they wanted to do was install a new headstone. And in the excavation, they found the old headstone. And it was forgotten, but endured. Harper's call for full human development, Black and white, male and female, also endures. As urgent and vital during these decades following the civil rights movement and women's liberation movement, as it was during Reconstruction and its aftermath. And so, in this year when we're all looking at so much of the change and transition in our society, the tension, the sometimes hate, and people not working together for the common good, Frances Harper is someone in our own heritage that we can give thanks to for her dedication and courage during times of great change. Frances Harper is a role model for determination and courage. Most of our lives don't often seem to offer opportunities to be courageous in that way. And yet, there are important ways for us to speak to our most deeply held beliefs. Are we not called to have courage when we speak the truth in love? Telling those with whom we disagree how we truly feel? Do we remain silent when others make statements or do things that go against our ethical beliefs? Do we remain silent, allowing others to assume by our silence that we condone their words and actions? And so, let us take a few moments to consider how we might choose to embody courage in our own lives.